Your goal after watching this video is to know the rules for multiplying integers. Alright, so first, I want to go back to like 3rd grade and quickly review what does it mean when you're multiplying. First of all, in our first example, 2 times 3, remember a dot means multiply. So what it means is that you have the first thing, you have 2 positives. And how many times do you have 2 positives? You have 3 sets of 2 positives. Okay, so in other words, you have 6 positives. So 2 times 3 is 6. We get so used to like robotically spitting out our math facts. 2 times 3, 6, 3 times 4, 12, 2 times 5, 10, that we kind of forget what multiplication means sometimes. All right, moving on to the next example. All right, when you have a number right next to parentheses like that, and there's nothing between the number and the parentheses, that means multiply. And as you progress through your middle school math and high school math and even math beyond high school, that's probably the most common way you will see multiplication written, as a number right next to parentheses. So in this case, it means the first number is what we have. We have 3 positives. How many times? 4. So 3 positives, 4 times. In other words, I have 12 positives. And lastly, sometimes, and this is the rarest that you will see, sometimes you will see that little asterisk star as a multiplication sign. So 2 times 5 means I have 2 and they're positives. And I have 2 positives 5 times. In other words, I have 10 positives. The reason we went over that really basic review is so when we start throwing negatives in there, it can make sense to why the answers are the way they are. Quick refresher on this, because this will be helpful as I go through the lesson. Remember, the commutative property applies to multiplication. So in other words, when you are just multiplying, when you have a problem that's just multiplying, switching the order that you multiply the numbers in won't change the answer. All right, switching the order that you multiply numbers in won't change the answer. Switching the order that you multiply numbers in, having the numbers commute from one place to another, won't change the answer. Okay, so now we're going to tackle integer multiplication. And we're going to tackle this using common sense. So the first thing is what you have. You have 2 negatives, or you owe $2. All right, and how many times do you owe $2? 3 times. All right, so there's 1, 2, 3. You owe $2 to 3 people. So altogether, you owe $6. All right, next problem. The first number says you owe $3. And how many times do you owe $3? Or how many sets of 3 negatives do you have? 4 sets. So altogether, that would be 12 negatives. All right, and next set, you owe 2, or you have 2 negatives. And how many times do you have those 2 negatives? You have them 5 times. You have 5 sets of 2 negatives. In other words, you have 10 negatives. All right, notice in each of these problems, we were multiplying 1 negative and 1 positive. 1 negative, the 4 is positive. 1 negative, the 5 is positive. And each time, we ended up with a negative answer. So, using common sense. All right, but what if common sense doesn't make sense? So in these problems, it says I have 2 negative 3 times. How do I have something negative times? Here it says I have 3 negative 4 times. How do I have 3 negative 4 times? How do I have something negative times? I can't wrap my brain around that. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, oh, but the commutative property applies to multiplication. So this times this is going to give me the same answer as if the numbers commute. And now this problem does make sense. It says, hey, I have 3 negatives. How many times do I have 3 negatives? Twice. So my answer is negative 6. Here, again, how do I have 3 negative times? How do you represent something negative times? But I know that when I multiply, this will give me the same answer as this, where the numbers have commuted to a different place in the problem. So now I can say, okay, that means I have 4 negatives 3 times. And last problem again, how can I have 2 negative times? But commutative property tells me the answer to this problem will be the same as the answer to this problem, which is easy to represent. I have 5 negatives, and I have 5 negatives 2 times. So my answer here is negative 10. All right. Again, I was multiplying 1 negative in each problem times 1 positive. All right. Second problem, 1 positive times 1 negative. Last problem, 1 negative times 1 positive, and in each of these problems, my answer ended up being negative. So I have just done 6 problems where we took a positive times a negative, and the answers were always negative. So you can figure that. You don't have to memorize a rule here. You should be able to use common sense to remember that a negative times a positive will always give you a negative, but you could also just memorize the rule. All right, when multiplying 2 numbers, we're looking at part 2 down here. When multiplying 2 numbers with different signs, so that means one's a positive and one's a negative, the product or the answer is always negative. All right, now we're going to work our way backwards a little. You know that when you multiply 2 numbers, 2 positive numbers, all right, so positive 2 times 4, positive 8. All right, 2 positive numbers, you always get a positive 8, or a positive number. So when you multiply 2 negative numbers, you are also always going to get a positive answer. Okay, so when multiplying 2 numbers with the same sign, the product is always positive. I multiplied these 2 numbers, they were both positive, they had the same sign, so I got a positive answer. I multiplied these 2 numbers together, and they had the same sign, they were both negative, so I got a positive answer again. So same sign, positive answer, different sign, negative answer. We're going to go back and do a few of those with the same sign. So here, I've got a negative times a negative. They have the same sign, 2 times 3 is 6, same sign, positive answer. Same sign, positive answer, and same sign, positive answer. Okay, now what if you're not just multiplying 2 numbers? In that case, just go right in order. So you can look at this as 2 separate multiplication problems. First, multiply the first 2. They have the same sign, and 10 times 6 is 60. Same sign, positive answer. Then we're going to multiply by 0. Same sign, positive answer, we get 0. Last example over here. All right, just start by multiplying the first 2 numbers. They have the same sign. That will give us a positive answer, which is positive 35. Now, we can multiply by that last term, which is negative 4. 35 times negative 4, they have different signs. One's positive and one's negative. So we have a negative answer, and because our signs are different, and we know 35 times 4 is not 70, that's 35 times 2. 35 times 4 would be 140. Your multiplication